everybody. I hope you're ready for another episode of Information Overload as we try to cram as much scripture oversight as we can in about 10 or 15 minutes. So this is part 2 in our overview series. Last week we went over the first, let's say 39 chapters in the book of Genesis. And so today we're going to be covering Genesis chapter 40 all the way to Exodus chapter 10. And this is a very, very 30,000 foot overview. So don't expect to get anything really super detailed in this. We're just going to kind of review what happened. Now, if you're following along with me because you're a part of my youth group, we will have another activity like we did last week. We're going to break off into groups, and we're going to be looking for something that stands out to us in these passages of Scripture. For everybody else, if you want to follow along, make this kind of like a personal study, you can do that as well. So we pick up with the story of Joseph. Now remember, Joseph was Jacob's son. The nation of Israel, his son, Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Now while in slavery, he went down to Egypt and he was bought by this Egyptian governor, basically. And some things happen, and Joseph ends up being the number 2 person in charge of all of Pharaoh's stuff, basically. He interpreted some of Pharaoh's dreams and realized that there would be 7 years of plenty, and then there'd be 7 years of famine. And so this is where we kind of start off here in chapters 40 and 41, where Joseph is interpreting dreams, not by his own authority, but by God's authority. And God shows Joseph favor in the sight of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just kind of grants him this place. It's called the vizier, V-I-Z-I-E-R. It's like the chief. It'd be like almost like the vice president, only with a lot more authority than what our vice president would have. And so, if you remember, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Joseph himself had a dream that all of them would be bowing down to him at some point. And it seems that like this dream is coming true. After the 7 years of plenty, Joseph stores up all this grain for Egypt and for the surrounding countries. They have just cities full of grain. And then here is Joseph's brothers and father and family up in the land of Canaan. The famine hits and they're literally starving to death. And so they go down to Egypt to beg for food. Joseph plays kind of a practical joke on them, wanting to see where they're at, I guess in their heart, because the last time he saw them, they were going to beat him up and sell him into slavery. First, they planned on killing him because they were so jealous of him. But instead, they just beat him up, threw him in a ditch, tell his dad he got torn apart by wild animals. So that's the last time he saw them. So he tells his brothers that he's just an Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian. He's talking in the Egyptian language, that sort of thing. And he basically takes all their money that they were going to pay for the grain with and puts it back on their donkeys. And they go off with some food and all their money. They realize that somebody stole something, or they think somebody stole something, and they're going to die because of it. So they don't return for a while until they're starving to death again. They come down, and Joseph reveals his true identity as their long-lost brother. They go back to their dad, who is Israel, who is Jacob, and lets him know that his favorite son, Joseph, actually wasn't mauled by wild animals, but that he was sold into slavery and has now become chief over everything. The only person higher in the land than Joseph would be the Pharaoh himself. So, first of all, I want to talk about that because that is an amazing story. One of the things that we hear about from the book of Genesis is that the Egyptians wouldn't even sit down and eat with the Israelites because they thought it was an abhorrent practice. They thought it was so disturbing and disgusting that they would actually not even sit down to eat with them. Even Joseph, who was second in the land, wouldn't sit down and eat with Joseph. And so you have this kind of racism that was happening here from the Egyptians to the Israelites. Now, Joseph's family moves down with him, and they settle in the land of Goshen. Now, modern scholars still don't know exactly where Goshen might have been. It's one of those sort of long lost secrets, and I'm going to try to give a least technical version of this that I can. So, the story of Joseph happens around 1800 BC. That's 4,000 years ago, whenever this story is taking place. The death of Joseph happens around 1805 BC. And so if you're taking notes or you're interested in this, this is my personal interpretation of the timeline, and I think it fits. Joseph is in Egypt. There's a land of plenty, 1805 BC, and you get Joseph dies, and you get all of the Israelites settling and multiplying in the land. After a few hundred years, or after a short period of time, Egypt becomes increasingly frightened that this tribe of Israelites is going to take over the entire land. There's hundreds of thousands of them at this point, and so they enslave all of them. They beat them, they make them work on their buildings and carrying heavy stone blocks and those sorts of things, all the things that the ancient Egyptians would have done. And so fast forward to Moses and the Exodus. So Moses comes along. Again, I believe he's the preserved, chosen bloodline that is going to take place here as God's chosen people. He is sent down the river, and he leads this Exodus. Now, I'm going to get back to some of the details, but I want to give an overview. Remember, 1805 BC, Joseph dies, and then you have a few hundred years until Moses leads the people out of the Exodus. Now, we won't quite get to the Exodus yet. We're going to get to the 10 plagues, but I want you to have this in your head. The Exodus probably happened in 1446 BC. That is an important date. It's an important date in Egyptian archaeology as well as Hebrew archaeology. And so whenever we get to the actual Exodus, I'll cover that in more detail. But if you're part of my class, or if you're just listening online and you want to figure something out, try to put together a timeline that might work in Egyptian history for the Exodus. Now, most historians are going to say it was during the reign of Ramses II because it talks about the Israelites working on a city named Ramses. However, that is a very tenuous connection between Egyptian and Israelite history. I kind of dismiss that because I think that was retroactively given. They were working around the area of Ramses, and they may have even been working on something of Ramses, but that might have been Ramses the First. It might have just been the city of Ramses. So I don't think that applies here. But look up who might have been Pharaoh in 1446. Some of the things to remember is Pharaoh's daughter. That was an official title. You might think of somebody who would have been a strong ruler of the Egyptians because he seems to have been very effective, and then all of a sudden look for his military campaigns to have ended rather quickly. Look for some sort of, what would you call it? Like a dramatic thing happening during the time of Egypt here. Maybe statues get destroyed, that sort of thing, because you know that if a figure led all these Israelites out of slavery, that there would be some sort of evidence for that, and somebody would be pretty ticked and try to erase them from history. And so look for all those things, and if you can find those, that's awesome. Maybe I'll give you some sort of prize if you're part of my youth group or something like that. But anyways, that's the story of Joseph all the way to whenever he dies in the land of Egypt. You fast forward to Moses. Moses is born into slavery, but his mom sends him down the river. It was during a time whenever the Pharaoh was killing all of the babies of that time. And so Pharaoh is going to kill all these little babies, so Moses' mom sends him down on a basket floating, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him on the banks as he's floating down. And she sees that it's a Hebrew baby, and she has compassion on this Hebrew baby. And she says, find one of the mothers who is a nursing mom to come and take care of this child for me, and I'm basically going to adopt this child as my own. She goes and finds Moses' mother to nurse him and take care of him. So what an amazing thing that happens. Moses would have been killed. His mom had faith, sent him down the river, and she herself gets to take care of him. Not only that, he's raised by Pharaoh's daughter. So once again, it looks like the nation of Israel within Egypt may be in a favorable position, placed there by God, to bring about the Lord's plan for this salvation of humanity, so we could say. And so Pharaoh's daughter takes care of him. He grows up and sees these two Egyptians beating some Israel slaves. And that just doesn't set well with him. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Moses was not raised among the Israelites in the same way. He wasn't a slave. He probably was taught all the same things that the Egyptians were taught. He was probably taught how to read and how to write, maybe more than almost anybody else. He may have been raised with a brother. In fact, if you saw the movie The Prince of Egypt, that's kind of how it was. It was Moses, and then his brother, who was co-regent, he became the new pharaoh, and they were at odds with one another. And so he was raised with this person who was a very effective military leader. And so you have Moses getting adopted by this family, being taught all the culture, being very intelligent, and that sort of thing. He leaves and has this encounter with a burning bush. And it's the actual manifestation of God on earth talking to Moses out of this bush. And this is where God reveals who he is for the first time here in Scripture. The name, I am who I am. In technical terms, it's called the Tetragrammaton because it's just a few short letters and it describes God. And he's explaining it in a way that's basically, I am self-evident. I am self-defining. I am who I am. You can't explain God in any other way. And so God is going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt using Moses and his brother Aaron to do the job. We're going through this really quickly. I'm just going to get into some of the things. Moses and Aaron come back, and they're begging Pharaoh to let their people go, and he is going to send plagues on Egypt. God is going to rain plagues down on Egypt in order to convince Pharaoh to soften his heart to let them go. Now, it goes through some of the genealogies here. It also goes through the plagues, and I don't want to have to list all these. I'll just go through them real quick. The first plague was the water turned to blood, which is actually something that Pharaoh's magicians and weirdos, the magicians and wizards who are the weirdos, begin to do. Then you get the second plague, which is frogs. The third plague is gnats. The fourth plague, which is a swarm of flies. The fifth plague is death of all the livestock in the land of Egypt. The sixth plague is boils, gross. The seventh plague is hail. The eighth plague is locusts. The ninth plague is darkness. And that is where Exodus chapter 10 ends. And so whenever we pick up, we're going to be looking at the last plague to go through Egypt. And we're also going to be focusing in on the Exodus. Now, this is not meant to replace your personal study as you go through this. Even the videos that I produce every day, just reading through it, are not meant to replace your own personal study. What I find really effective is if God is leading you to investigate the scripture further, stop and investigate. Take all your time and resources and really learn one thing. Imagine studying one verse of scripture for 8 hours straight. What do you think you could get out of that verse? Now, we've just looked at over 50 verses of scripture in just a couple of weeks. Now, that's just flying through it too quickly to really absorb a lot, but I think it's effective every once in a while for us to stop and see all of Scripture from front to back. Now, we can stop and hone in on anything that we need to talk about, but in the meantime, we're just going to keep pressing through this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment, ask me anything you want, ask me whenever we're meeting together for youth group or anything like that. But in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and break off into our groups, and we're going to focus in on one part of Scripture that really just stands out to us. I want you to discuss it in your groups. I want you to stay between Genesis 40 and Exodus chapter 10, because that's what we're covering this week, and just try to pick something that stands out to you and try to teach yourself, teach your group, and then teach all those around you what you've learned. Thank you for tuning in. And you are watching the DiscipleSmith's podcast.